Heart and Head. This seems a suitable place to set forth the Maharishi's teaching about head and hearts. He taught that the heart, not the head, is the true seat of consciousness. But by this, he did not mean the physical organ at the left side of the chest, but the heart at the right. And by consciousness, he did not mean thought, but pure awareness or sense of being. He had found this from his own experience to be the center of spiritual awareness, and then found his experience confirmed in some ancient texts. When his devotees were instructed to concentrate on the heart, it was this spiritual heart on the right that was referred to, and they also found it the center of an actual, almost physical vibration of awareness. However, he would also speak of the heart as equivalent to the self, and remind them that in truth it is not in the body at all, but is spaceless. D. Why do you say that the heart is on the right when biologists have found it to be on the left? What authority have you? B. No one denies that the physical organ is on the left, but the heart of which I speak is on the right. That is my experience, and I require no authority for it. Still, you can find confirmation of it in a Malayali book on Ayurveda and in the Sita Upanishad. D. Why do we have a place such as the heart to concentrate on for meditation? B. Because you seek true consciousness. Where can you find it? Can you attain it outside yourself? You have to find it internally. Therefore, you are directed inward. The heart is the seat of consciousness, or consciousness itself. I ask you to observe where the I arises in your body, but it is not really quite correct to say that the I arises from and merges in the chest at the right side. The heart is another name for reality, and this is neither inside nor outside the body. There can be no in or out for it, since it alone is. I do not mean by heart any physiological organ or any plexus or nerves or anything like that. But so long as a man identifies himself with the body or thinks he is in the body, he is advised to see where in the body the I thought arises and merges again. It must be the heart at the right side of the chest, since every man of whatever race and religion and in whatever language he may be speaking points to the right side of the chest to indicate himself when he says I. This is so all over the world, so that must be the place. And by keenly watching the emergence of the I thought on waking and its subsidence on going to sleep, one can see that it is in the heart on the right side. When a room is dark, you need a lamp to light it. But when the sun rises, there is no need for a lamp. Objects are seen without one. And to see the sun itself, no lamp is needed, because it is self-luminous. Similarly, with the mind. The reflected light of the mind is necessary to perceive objects, but to see the heart, it is enough for the mind to be turned towards it. Then the mind loses itself and the heart shines forth. D. There are said to be 6 subtle organs of different colors in the chest, of which the spiritual heart is said to be the one situated 2 fingers breadth to the right from the center. But the heart is also said to be formless. Does that mean that we should imagine it to have a form and meditate on this? B. No. Only the quest, who am I, is necessary. That which continues to exist throughout sleep and waking is the same being in both. But while waking, there is unhappiness, and therefore the effort to remove it. When asked, who awakes from sleep, you say, I. Hold fast onto this I. If that is done, the eternal being reveals itself. The most important thing is the investigation of the I, and not concentration on the heart center. There is no such thing as the inner and the outer. Both words mean the same or nothing at all. Nevertheless, there is also the practice of concentration on the heart center, which is a form of spiritual exercise. Only he who concentrates on the heart can remain aware when the mind ceases to be active and remains still, with no thoughts, whereas those who concentrate on any other center cannot retain awareness without thought, but only infer that the mind was still after it has become active again. D. Thoughts suddenly cease, and I rises up equally suddenly and continues. It is only a feeling, not a thought. Can it be right? B. Yes, it is quite right. Thoughts have to cease and reason to disappear, for the I to rise up and be left. Feeling is the main thing, not reason. D. Moreover, it is not in the head, but at the right side of the chest. B. That is where it should be, because the heart is there. D. When I look outward, it disappears. What should I do? B. Hold fast to it. This does not mean that thought is impossible during the state of I consciousness, as indeed one can see from the example of Bhagwan himself, who was permanently in that state. For the ignorant person, thought is like a dense cloud overhead, shutting him off from the illuminations of the sun. When the ceiling of cloud has been broken and rolled back, letting in the light, he can use thought without being imprisoned by it. To change the metaphor, Bhagwan sometimes compared the mind of the realized man to the moon in the sky in daytime. It is there, but its light is not needed, because one can see without it by the direct light of the sun. Suffering. One of the problems about which Bhagwan was often asked was suffering. The questions were usually personal rather than academic, since it was often the experience of grief which drove people to seek solace from him. The real solace came as a silent influence, but he did also answer theoretical questions. The usual answer was to bid the questioner find out who it is that suffers, just as he would bid the doubter find who it is that doubts. For the self is beyond suffering as it is beyond doubt. Sometimes, however, on a more contingent level, he would point out that whatever makes the person dissatisfied with his state of ignorance and turns him to the quest of the self is beneficial, and that it is often suffering which is the means of doing this. B. The bliss of self is always yours, and you will find it if you seek it earnestly. The cause of your misery is not in your outer life. It is in you as your ego. You impose limitations on yourself and then make a vain struggle to transcend them. All unhappiness is due to the ego. With it comes all your trouble. What does it avail you to contribute the cause of misery to the happenings of life when that cause is really within you? What happiness can you get from things extraneous to yourself? When you get it, how long will it last? If you would deny the ego and scorch it by ignoring it, you would be free. If you accept it, it will impose limitations on you and throw you into a vain struggle to transcend them. That was how the thief sought to ruin King Janak. To be the self that you really are is the only means to realize the bliss that is ever yours. A very devoted and simple devotee had lost his only son, a child of 3. The next day, he arrived at the ashramam with his family. Referring to them, Bhagwan said, "Training of mind helps one to bear sorrows and bereavements with courage. But the loss of one's children is said to be the worst of all griefs. Grief only exists as long as one considers oneself to have a definite form. If the form is transcended, one knows the oneself to be eternal. There is neither birth nor death. What is born is only the body, and this is the creation of the ego. But the ego is not ordinarily perceived without the body, and so is identified with it. It is thought that matters. Let the sensible man consider whether he knew his body while in sleep deep. Why then does he feel it in the waking state? Although the body was not felt in sleep, did not the self exist? What was his state when in deep sleep, and what is it now when awake? What is the difference? The ego rises up, and that is waking. Simultaneously, thoughts arise. Find out who has the thoughts. Where do they come from? They must arise from the conscious self. Apprehending this even vaguely helps towards extinction of the ego. The realization of the one infinite existence becomes possible. In that state, there are no individuals, but only eternal being. Hence, there is no thought of death or grieving. If a man thinks that he is born, he cannot escape the fear of death. Let him find out whether he was born or whether the self takes birth. He will discover that the self always exists, and that the body which is born resolves itself into thought, and that the emergence of thought is the root of all mischief. Find where thought comes from, and then you will abide in the ever-present inmost self and be free from the idea of birth and fear of death. D. If someone we love dies, it causes grief. Should we avoid such grief by either loving all alike or not loving at all? B. If someone we love dies, it causes grief to the one who continues living. The way to get rid of grief is not to continue living. Kill the griever, and who will then remain to grieve? The ego must die. That is the only way. The two alternatives you suggest amount to the same. When all are realized to be the one self, who is there to love or hate? Visitor. Widespread distress such as famine and pestilence spreads havoc through the world. What is the cause of this state of affairs? B. To whom does all this appear? Visitor. That won't do. I see misery all around. B. You were not conscious of the world and its sufferings while asleep, but now you are that you are awake. Continue in the state in which you are not affected by such things. When you are not aware of the world, that is to say, when you remain as the self in the state of sleep, its sufferings do not affect you. Therefore turn inwards and seek the self, and there will be an end both of the world and of its miseries. Visitor. But that is selfishness. B. The world is not external to you. Because you wrongly identify yourself with the body, you see the world outside you, and its suffering becomes apparent to you. But the world and its sufferings are not real. Seek the reality and get rid of this unreal feeling. Visitor. There are great men and public workers who cannot solve the problem of suffering in the world. B. That is because they are based on the ego. If they remained in the self, it would be different. Visitor. Why don't Mahatmas help? B. How do you know that they don't? Public speeches, outer activity, and material help are all outweighed by the silence of the Mahatmas. They accomplish more than others. Visitor. What can we do to ameliorate the condition of the world? B. If you remain free from pain, there will be no pain anywhere. The trouble now is due to your seeing the world outside yourself and thinking there is pain in it. But both the world and the pain are within you. If you turn inwards, there will be no pain. Visitor. God is perfect. Why did He create the world imperfect? A work partakes of the nature of its author. But in this case, it is not so. B. Are you something separate from God that you should ask this question? So long as you consider yourself the body, you see the world as external to you. It is to you that the imperfection appears. God is perfection, and His work is also perfection. But you see it as imperfect because of your wrong identification with the body or the ego. Visitor. Why did the self manifest as this miserable world? B. In order that you might seek it. Your eyes cannot see themselves, but if you hold a mirror in front of them, they see themselves. Creation is the mirror. See yourself first, and then see the whole world as self. Visitor. Then what it amounts to is that I should always turn inwards? B. Yes. Visitor. Shouldn't I see the world at all? B. You are not told to shut your eyes to the world, but only to see yourself first and then see the whole world as a self. If you consider yourself as the body, the world appears to be external. If you are the self, the world appears as Brahman manifested. D. I have a toothache. Is that only a thought? B. Yes. D. Then why can't I think that there is no toothache and so I cure myself? B. One does not feel the toothache when one is absorbed in other thoughts or when asleep. D. But still it remains. B. So strong is man's conviction of the reality of the world that it is not easily shaken off. But the world is no more real than the individual who sees it. D. At present there is a Sino-Japanese war going on. If it is only the imagination, can or will Sri Bhagavan imagine it not to be going on and so put an end to it? B. Laughing. The Bhagavan of the questioner is as much a thought of his as the Sino-Japanese war. D. But why should there be suffering now? B. If there were no suffering, how could the desire to be happy arise? If that desire did not arise, how could the quest of the self arise? D. Then is all suffering good? B. Yes. What is happiness? Is it a healthy and handsome body, regular meals and so on? Even an emperor has endless troubles, although he may be in good health. So all suffering is due to the false notion, I am the body. Get rid of this, is knowledge. Sin. Sin and evil of every kind are the result of egoism unrestrained by consideration for the injury caused to others or the deleterious effect on the sinner's own character. Religions guard against them by moral and disciplinary codes and emotional appeals, seeking to keep the ego within bounds and prevent its trespassing into forbidden places. However, a spiritual path that is so radical and direct as to deny the ego itself does not need to attend specifically to the various excesses of egoism. All egoism has to be renounced. Therefore, non-duality turns the attack of the ego itself, not on its specific manifestations. However sinful a person may be, if he would stop wailing inconsolably, Alas, I am a sinner, how shall I attain liberation? And, casting away even the thought that he is a sinner, if he would zealously carry on meditation on the self, he would most assuredly get reformed. Similarly, a discipline which aims at transcending thought completely in realization of the super-rational self does not need to inveigh specifically against evil thoughts. All thoughts are distractions. A European lady asked whether good thoughts were not helpful in seeking realization, at any rate in the early stages, like the lower rungs of the ladder, and was told, yes, in so far as they keep off bad thoughts, but they themselves must disappear before the state of realization, because the quality of purity, sattva, is the real nature of the mind, clearless like that of the unclouded sky in the characteristic of the mind expanse. Being stirred up by the quality of activity, rajas, the mind becomes restless and influenced by darkness, tamas, manifests as the physical world. The mind thus becoming restless on the one hand and appearing as solid matter on the other, the real is not discerned. Just as fine silk threads cannot be woven with the use of a heavy iron shuttle, or the delicate shades of a work of art be distinguished in the light of a lamp flickering in the wind, so is realization of truth impossible with the mind rendered gross by darkness or tamas, and restless by activity or rajas. Because truth is exceedingly subtle and serene, mind will be cleared of its impurities only by a desireless performance of duties during several births, getting a worthy master, learning from him, and incessantly practicing meditation on the Supreme. The transformation of the mind into the world of inert matter due to the quality of darkness, and its restlessness due to the quality of activity, will cease. Then the mind regains its subtlety and composure. The bliss of the self can manifest only in a mind rendered subtle and steady by assiduous meditation. He who experiences that bliss is liberated even while still alive. D. I am a sinner and do not perform any religious duties. Shall I have a painful rebirth because of that? B. Why do you say you are a sinner? Faith in God is enough to save you from rebirth. Cast all your burden on Him. In the Tiruvachakam it is said, "Though I am worse than a dog, you have graciously undertaken to protect me. The delusion of death and rebirth is maintained by you. Is it for me to sit and judge? Am I the Lord here? Almighty God, it is for you to roll me through many bodies or keep me fixed at your feet. Therefore have faith, and that will save you." D. There is more pleasure in meditation than in sensual enjoyment, and yet the mind seeks the latter and not the former. Why is that? B. Pleasure and pain are only aspects of the mind. Our essential nature is happiness, but we have forgotten the self and imagine that the body or the mind is the self. It is this wrong identification that gives rise to misery. What is to be done? This tendency is very deep-rooted and has continued for many past births and so has grown strong. It will have to go before the essential nature, which is happiness, can be realized. D. Swami, how can the grip of the ego be loosened? B. By not adding new vasanas, bad habits, to it. If the objective reality of the world be an illusion, then the evil in it is also an illusion, and the remedy is to turn inwards to the reality of the self. An American visitor, the secretary of Swami Yogananda, asked why there are good and evil in the world, and was told, "They are relative terms. There must be a subject to know the good and evil. That subject is the ego. It ends in the self. Or you can say that the source of the ego is God." This definition is probably more definite and understandable for you. God. Superficially, it might seem that the Maharishi's statements about God were inconsistent, since he would sometimes enjoin complete faith and submission to God, and sometimes speak of God as unreal. But actually there was no inconsistency. It must always be remembered that the purpose of his exposition was not to propound a philosophy, but to give practical guidance on the spiritual path. Someone who could conceive of the non-dual self could understand that it was his own self and the self of God and of the world also, whereas one who clung to the apparent reality of his ego could understand the self only as the God who had created him. According to their needs, he explained. In this, as in other matters, he pointed out the uselessness of discussion. Following either path was useful. Theorizing about them was not. All religions postulate the three fundamentals: the world, the soul, and God. But it is the one reality that manifests itself as these three. One can say the three are really three, only so long as the ego lasts. Therefore, to inhere in one's being when the ego is dead is the perfect state. The world is real. No, it is mere illusory appearance. The world is conscience. No, the world is happiness. No. What use is it to argue thus? That state is agreeable to all wherein, having given up the objective outlook, one knows one's self and loses all notions either of unity or duality, of oneself and the ego. If one has form, oneself, the world and God will also appear to have form. But if one is formless, who is to see these forms, and how? Without the eye, can any object be seen? The seeing self is the eye, and that eye is the eye of infinity. Brahman is not to be seen or known. It is beyond the threefold relationship of seer, sight, and seen, or knower, knowledge, and known. The reality remains ever as it is. The existence of ignorance or the world is due to our illusion. Neither knowledge nor ignorance is real. What lies beyond them, as beyond all pairs of opposites, is the reality. It is neither light nor darkness, but beyond both, though we sometimes speak of it as light and of light as its shadow. Mr. Thompson, a very quiet young gentleman who has been staying in India for some years and studying Hindu philosophy as an earnest student, asked, Srimad Bhagavad Gita says, I am the prop for Brahman. In another place it says, I am in the heart of each one. Thus the different aspects of the ultimate principle are revealed. I take it that there are three aspects, namely, the transcendental, the immanent, and the cosmic. Is realization to be in any of these or in all of them? Coming to the transcendental from the cosmic, Vedanta discards the names and forms as being Maya. Again, Vedanta also says that the whole is Brahman, as illustrated by gold and ornaments of gold. How are we to understand the truth? B. The Gita says, Brahmano hi pratishtaham. If that aham is known, the whole is unknown. D. That is the immanent aspect only. B. You now think that you are an individual. Outside you there is the universe, and beyond the universe is God. So there is the idea of separateness. The idea must go. For God is not separate from you or the cosmos. The Gita also says, I am the Self, O Gudakesha, seated in the heart of all beings. I am the beginning and the middle and also the end of all beings. Thus, God is not only in the heart of all, He is the prop of all. He is the source of all, their abiding place and their end. All proceed from Him, have their stay in Him, and finally resolve into Him. Therefore, He is not separate. D. How are we to understand the line in the Gita, this whole cosmos forms a particle of me? B. It does not mean that a small particle of God separates from Him and forms the universe. His Shakti is acting, and as a result of one phase of such activity, the cosmos has become manifest. Similarly, the statement in Purusha Sukta, Padosya Vishwa Bhutani, that is, all beings form one of his parts, does not mean that Brahman is in 4 parts. D. I understand that Brahman is certainly not divisible. B. So, the fact is that Brahman is all and remains indivisible. He is ever realized. However, man does not know this, and it is just what he has to know. Knowledge means overcoming the obstacles which obstruct the revelation of the eternal truth, that the self is the same Brahman. The obstacles taken all together form your idea of separateness as an individual. Therefore, the present attempt will result in the truth being revealed that the self is not separate from Brahman. Dr. Emil Gauthier, S.J., Professor of Philosophy at the Sacred Heart College, Shen Baganur, Kodaikanal, asked, "Can you kindly give me a summary of your teachings?" B. They are found in the booklets, particularly in Who Am I? D. I shall read them, but may I have the central point of your teaching from your own lips? B. The central point is just the thing. D. Is it not clear to me what you mean by that? B. That you should find the center. D. I come from God. Isn't God distinct from me? B. Who asks this question? God does not. You do. So find who you are, and then you may find out whether God is distinct from you. D. But God is perfect and I am imperfect. How can I ever know Him fully? B. God does not say so. It is you who ask the question. After finding out who you are, you may know what God is. D. But you have found yourself. Please let us know if God is distinct from you. B. It is a matter of experience. Each one must experience it for himself. D. Oh, I see. God is infinite and I am finite. I have a personality which can never merge into God. Isn't that so? B. Infinity and perfection do not admit of parts. If a finite being is apart from infinity, the perfection of infinity is marred. Thus your statement is a contradiction in terms. D. No. See, there is both God and creation. B. How are you aware of your personality? D. I have a soul. I know it by its activities. B. Did you know it in deep sleep? D. The activities are suspended in deep sleep. B. But you exist in sleep, and you do now too. Which of these two is your real state? D. Sleep and waking are mere accidents. I am the substance behind the accidents. He looked up at the clock and said that it was time for him to catch the train. He left after thanking Sri Bhagwan. So the conversation ended abruptly. The following talk takes up various problems which plague philosophers and theologians: divine omniscience and free will, natural laws and divine activity, personal God and impersonal, and yet the tone of the answer shows that Bhagwan considers it of rather secondary importance. D. What is the relation between my free will and the overshadowing might of the omnipotent? Is the omnipotence of God consistent with the ego's free will? Is the omniscience of God consistent with the ego's free will? Are natural laws consistent with God's free will? B. Yes. Free will is the present appearing to a limited faculty of sight and will. That same ego sees its past activity as falling into a course of law or rules, its own free will being one of the links in the course of law. The omnipotence and omniscience of God are then seen by the ego to have acted through the appearance of his own free will. So he comes to the conclusion that the ego must go by appearances. Natural laws are manifestations of God's will, and they have been laid down. D. Is God personal? B. Yes. He is always the first person, the I, ever standing before you. Because you give precedence to worldly things, God appears to have receded to the background. If you give up all else and seek Him alone, He will remain as the I, the Self. D. The final state of realization is said according to Advaita to be absolute union with the Divine, and according to Vishisht Advaita, a qualified union, while Dvaita maintains that there is no union at all. Which of these should be considered the correct view? B. Why speculate about what will happen at some time in the future? All are agreed that the I exists. To whichever school of thought he may belong, let the earnest seeker first find out what the I is. Then it will be time enough to know what the final state will be. Whether the I will get merged in the Supreme Being or stand apart from Him. Let us not forestall the conclusion, but keep an open mind. D. But will not some understanding of the final state be a helpful guide even to the aspirant? B. No purpose is served by trying to decide now what the final state of realization will be. It has no intrinsic value. D. Why not? B. Because you proceed on a wrong principle. Your conclusion is arrived at by the intellect which shines only by the light it derives from the self. It is not presumptuous on the part of the intellect to sit in judgment over that form from which it derives its little light. How can the intellect, which can never reach the self, be competent to ascertain, and much less decide, the nature of the final state of realization? It is like trying to measure the sunlight at its source by the standard of the light given by a candle. The wax will melt down before the candle comes anywhere near the sun. Instead of indulging in mere speculation, devote yourself here and now to the search for the truth that is ever within you. D. Why are so many gods mentioned? B. The body is only one, but how many functions are performed by it? The source of all these functions is one. It is the same with gods. D. Are the gods, Ishwar and Vishnu and the heavens, Kailash and Vaikuntha real? B. as real as you are in this body. D. I mean, have they got a phenomenal existence like my body, or are they pure fictions like the horns of a hare? B. They do exist. D. If so, they must be somewhere. Where are they? B. In you. D. Then they are only my idea, something which I create and control? B. Everything is. D. But I can create a pure fiction like the horns of a hare, or a partial truth like a mirage, while there are also facts which exist irrespective of my imagination. Do the gods Ishwar and Vishnu exist like that? B. Yes. D. Is God subject to cosmic dissolution at the end of a cycle? B. Why should he be? A man who realizes the self transcends cosmic dissolution and is liberated. Why should not Ishvara, who is infinitely wiser and abler than a man? D. Do gods and devils also exist? B. Yes. D. How are we to conceive of supreme divine consciousness? B. As that which is. Particularly interesting are the questions asked by a Muslim professor about the hymns which Bhagwan wrote to God in the form of Arunachala. D. I have been reading the 5 hymns. I find that the hymns are addressed by you to Arunachala. But you are a non-dualist, so how can you address God as a separate being? B. The devotee, God, and the hymns are all the self. D. But you are addressing God. You are specifying this as Arunachala Hill as God. B. You can identify the self with the body. So why shouldn't the devotees identify the self with Arunachala? D. If Arunachala is the self, why should it be specifically picked out among so many other hills? God is everywhere. Why do you specify him as Arunachala? B. What has attracted you from Allahabad to this place? What has attracted all these people around? D. Sri Bhagwan. B. How was I attracted here? By Arunachala. The power cannot be denied. Again, Arunachala is within and not without. The self is Arunachala. D. Several terms are used in the holy books: Atman, Paramatman, Para, etc. What is the gradation among them? B. They mean the same to the user of the words, but they are understood differently by various persons according to their development. D. But why do you use so many words to mean the same thing? B. It depends on the circumstances. They all mean the self. Para means not relative or beyond the relative. That is to say, the absolute. Why worry about God? We do not know whether God exists, but we know that we exist. So first concentrate on yourself and find out who you are. The Malayalam version of Ulladu Narpadu, or 40 verses, was read out by a devotee for the benefit of a visitor. After hearing it, the latter asked, "What about the reference to duality during one's effort and unity at the end?" B. It refers to people who think one must begin one's spiritual striving with a dualistic idea. They say that there is God and that one must worship and meditate until ultimately the individual merges into God. Others say that the individual and the Supreme Being always remain separate and never merge. But let's not worry now about what happens at the end. All agree that the individual exists now. So let a man discover it. That is, discover his self. There will be a time enough afterwards to find out whether the self is to merge in the Supreme, or is a part of it, or remains separate. Let us not forestall the conclusion. Keep an open mind. Dive within and find the self. The truth will dawn upon you all right. So why try to decide beforehand whether it is absolute or qualified unity or duality? There is no meaning in doing so. Your decision would have to be made by logic and intellect. But the intellect derives its light from the self or the highest power. So how can its reflected and partial light envisage the entire and original light? The intellect cannot attain to the self. So how can it ascertain its nature? The self alone is real. All else is unreal. The mind and the intellect have no existence apart from you. The Bible says, "Be still and know that I am God." Stillness is the only thing needed to realize that I am is God. The whole Vedanta is contained in the two biblical statements, I am that I am, and be still and know that I am God. D. What should one think of when meditating? B. What is meditation? It is the suspension of thoughts. You are perturbed by thoughts which rush one after the other. Hold on to one thought so that the others are expelled. Continuous practice gives the necessary strength of mind to engage in meditation. Meditation differs according to the degree of advancement of the seeker. If one is fit for it, one can hold directly to the thinker, and the thinker will automatically sink into his source, which is pure consciousness. If one cannot directly hold on to the thinker, one must meditate on God, and in due course, the same individual will have become sufficiently pure to hold on to the thinker and sink into the absolute being. D. God is described as manifest and unmanifest. As the former, he is said to include the world as part of his being. If that is so, we, as part of the world, should find it easy to know him in his manifested form. B. Know yourself before you seek to know the nature of God and the world. D. Does knowing myself imply knowing God? B. Yes. God is within you. D. Then what stands in the way of my knowing myself or God? B. Your wandering mind and perverted ways. D. I am a weak creature, but why does not the superior power of the Lord within remove the obstacles? B. Yes, he will, if you have the aspiration. D. Why should he not create the aspiration in me? B. Then surrender yourself. D. If I surrender myself, is no prayer to God necessary? B. Surrender itself is a mighty prayer. D. But is it not necessary to understand His nature before one surrenders oneself? B. If you believe that God will do all things that you want Him to do, then surrender yourself to Him. Otherwise, let God alone and know yourself. D. We are worldly people and afflicted by some grief that we cannot get over. We pray to God and are still not satisfied. What should we do? B. Trust God. D. We surrender, but still there is no help. B. But if you have surrendered, it means that you must accept the will of God and not make a grievance of what may not happen to please you. Things may turn out differently from what they appear. Distress often leads people to faith in God. D. But we are worldly people. We have wife, children, friends and relations. We cannot ignore them and resign ourselves to the divine will without retaining some trace of individuality. B. That means that you have not really surrendered, as you say you have. All you need to do is to trust God. The Lord bears the burden of the world. Know that the spurious ego which presumes to bear that burden is like a sculpted figure at the foot of a temple tower, which appears to sustain the tower's weight. Whose fault is it if the traveller, instead of putting his luggage in the cart, which bears the load anyway, carries it on his head to his own inconvenience? Surrender to Him and accept His will, whether He appears or vanishes. Await His pleasure. If you want Him to do as you want, it is not surrender but command. You cannot ask Him to obey you and yet think you have surrendered. He knows what is best and when and how to do it. Leave everything entirely to Him. The burden is His, and you have no more cares. All your cares are His. That is what is meant by surrender. They pray to God and finish with, Thy will be done. If His will be done, why do they pray at all? It is true that the divine will prevails at all times and under all circumstances. Individuals cannot act of their own accord. Recognize the force of the divine will and keep quiet. Everyone is looked after by God. He created all. You are only one among 2,000 millions. When He looks after so many, will He omit you? Even common sense dictates that one should accept His will. There is no need to tell Him your requirements. He knows them Himself and will look after them. D. Are our prayers granted? B. Yes, they are granted. No thought will ever go in vain. Every thought will produce its effect some time or other. Thought force will never go in vain. Not from any desire, resolve or effort on the part of the rising sun, but merely due to the presence of his rays. The lens emits heat, the lotus blossoms, water evaporates, and people attend to their various duties in life. In the proximity of the magnet, the needle moves. Similarly, the soul or jiva, subjected to the threefold activity of creation, preservation, and destruction, which takes place merely due to the unique presence of the Supreme Lord, performs acts in accordance with its karma, and subsides to rest after such activity. But the Lord himself has no resolve, no act or event touches even the fringe of his being. This state of immaculate aloofness can be likened to that of the sun, which is untouched by the activities of life, or to that of the all-pervasive ether, which is not affected by the interaction of the complex qualities of the other four elements. Religions. It should be clear from what we said in previous section that Bhagwan's teaching was not opposed to any religion. If philosophers or theologians wish to argue whether the human soul was permanently and essentially separate from the divine being, he would refuse to join issue with them but try to turn them to spiritual effort instead, as for instance in his talk with the Jesuit priest on page 39. When they attained realization, they would know, and theoretical knowledge without realization would not help them anyway. Strictly speaking, Bhagwan was not exclusively a Hindu or subject to Hindu ritual, since Hinduism recognizes that one who is established in constant, conscious identity with the self is above all religions. He is the mountain peak towards which the various paths converge. Bhagwan had many followers who were not Hindus, Christians, Muslims, Parsis, and others, and none was ever recommended to change his religion. A religion involves two modes of activity, what might be called the horizontal and the vertical. Horizontally, it harmonizes and controls the life of the individual and society in conformity with its faith and morality, giving opportunity and incentive for a good life leading to a good death. Vertically, it provides spiritual paths for those who strive to attain a higher state or realize the ultimate truth during this life on earth. Horizontally, religions are mutually exclusive but not really contradictory. Bhagwan was concerned rather with the vertical mode, the paths to realization, and therefore his teaching clashed with no religion. It guided those who would follow him on the most direct and central path, the quest of the self. And for this, any religion could serve as a foundation. He approved of every religion, and if some devotees came to him who followed no formal religion, he did not insist that they should do so. When asked about the different religious practices, he would stress their deeper meaning and about different religions, their basic unity. D. What is yoga? B. Yoga, or union, is necessary for one who is in a state of viyoga or separation. But really, there is only one. If you realize the self, there will be no difference. D. Is there any efficacy in bathing in the Ganges? B. The Ganges is within you. Bathe in this Ganges. It will not make you shiver with cold. D. Should we sometimes read the Bhagavad Gita? B. Always. D. May we read the Bible? B. The Bible and the Gita are the same. D. The Bible teaches that man is born in sin. B. Man is sin. There is no feeling of being man, is deep sleep. The body thought brings out the idea of sin. The birth of thought itself is sin. D. The Bible says that the human soul may be lost. B. The I thought is the ego, and that is lost. The real I is I am that I am. The doctrine of the Trinity was explained. God the Father is equivalent to Ishvara, God the Son to the Guru, and God the Holy Ghost to the Atman. Ishvaro Gururatmati Murti Bheda Vibhajane Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshinamurtiye Namaha means that God appears to his devotee in the form of a Guru or Son of God and points out to him the immanence of the Holy Spirit. That is to say, that God is Spirit, that this Spirit is immanent everywhere, and that the Self must be realized, which is the same as realizing God. D. There is a short account of the spiritual experiences of Saint Teresa in the March number of Prabuddha Bharata. She was devoted to a figure of the Madonna, which became animated to her sight, and she was in bliss. Is this the same as Shaktipata? B. The animated figure indicates the depth of meditation or dhyana bala. Shaktipata prepares the mind for introversion. There is a process of concentration of the mind on one's own shadow, which in due course becomes animated and answers questions put to it. That is due to strength of mind or depth of meditation. Whatever is external is also transitory. Such phenomena may produce joy for the time being, but abiding peace or shanti does not result. That is got only by the removal of avidya or ignorance. D. Can't we see God in concrete form? B. Yes, God is seen in the mind. A concrete form may be seen, but still it is only in the devotee's mind. The form and appearance in which God manifests are determined by the mind of the devotee, but that is not the ultimate experience. There is a sense of duality in it. It is like a dream or vision. After God is perceived, self-inquiry begins, and that leads to realization of the self. Self-inquiry is the ultimate route. Question: what is the best of all religions? What is Bhagwan's method? B. All methods and religions are the same. Question: but different methods are taught for attaining liberation. B. Why should you be liberated? Why not remain as you are now? Question: I want to get rid of pain. To be rid of pain is said to be liberation. B. That is what all religions teach. Questioner: but what is the method? B. Go back the way you came. Question: where did I come from? B. That is just what you have to find out. Did these questions arise when you were asleep? And yet you existed then. Were you not the same person? Question: yes, I existed in sleep. So did the mind. But the senses had merged so that I could not speak. B. Are you the individual? Are you the mind? Did the mind announce itself to you when you were asleep? Question: no, but the authorities say that the individuality is different from God. B. Never mind about God. Speak for yourself. Question: What about myself? Who am I? B. That is just what you have to find out. Then you will know everything. If you do not, it will be time enough to ask then. Question. When I wake, I see the world and I am not changed at all. B. But you do know this when asleep. And yet you exist in both states. Who has changed now? Is it your nature to change or to remain unchanging? Q. What is the proof? B. Does one require proof of one's own being? Only remain aware of yourself and all else will be known. Q. Why then do the dualists and non-dualists quarrel among themselves? B. If each would attend to his own business of seeking realization, there would be no quarrel. D. Is the experience of the highest state the same to all, or is there any difference? B. The highest state is the same and the experience is the same. D. But I find some difference in the interpretation given of the highest truth. B. The interpretations are made with the mind. The minds are different, so the interpretations also differ. D. I mean to say that the seers express themselves differently. B. Their modes of expression may differ according to the nature of the seekers for whose guidance they are intended. D. One speaks in terms of Christianity, another of Islam, a third of Buddhism, etc. Is that due to their upbringing? B. Whatever may be their upbringing, their experience is the same. Only the modes of expression differ according to circumstances. D. Different teachers have set up different schools and proclaimed different truths and so confused people. Why? B. They have all taught the same truth, but from different standpoints. Such differences were necessary to meet the needs of different minds, differently constituted, but they all reveal the same truth. D. Since they have recommended different paths, which is one to follow? B. You speak of paths as if you were somewhere and the self somewhere else, and you have to go and attain it. But in fact, the self is here and now, and you are. It always is. It is like being here and asking people the way to Ramana Ashramam, and then complaining that each one shows a different path, and asking which to follow. D. Why do religions speak of gods, heaven, hell, etc.? B. Only to make people realize that they are on a par with this world and that the self alone is real. The religions are according to the viewpoint of the seeker. Take the Bhagavad Gita, for instance. When Arjuna said he would not fight against his own relations and elders in order to kill them and gain the kingdom, Sri Krishna said, "Not that these, you or I, were not before, are not now, nor will be hereafter. None was born, none has died, nor will it be so hereafter." And so on. Later, as he developed the theme and declared that he had given the same instruction to the sun, through him to Ishwaku, etc., Arjuna raised the doubt, "How can that be? You were born a few years ago. They lived ages ago." Then Sri Krishna, understanding Arjuna's standpoint, said, "Yes, there have been many incarnations of myself and yourself. I know them all, but you do not. Such statements appear contradictory, but still both are right according to the point of view of the questioner. Christ also declared, "Before Abraham was, I am." D. What is the purpose of such description in religion? B. Only to establish the reality of the self. D. Bhagavan always speaks from the highest standpoint. B. Smiling. People will not understand the bare and simple truth, the truth of their everyday, ever-present and eternal experience. That is the truth of the self. Is there anyone not aware of the self? Yet they do not even like to hear of it, whereas they are eager to know what lies beyond heaven and hell and reincarnation. Because they love mystery and not plain truth, religions pamper them, only to bring them round to the self in the end. Moreover, much as you may wander, you must return ultimately to the self. So why not abide in the self here and now? All the scriptures are meant only to make a man retrace his steps to his original source. He need not acquire anything new. He only has to give up the false ideas and useless accretions. Instead of doing this, however, he tries to grasp something strange and mysterious because he believes his happiness lies elsewhere. That is the mistake. All scriptures, without exception, proclaim that for attaining salvation, the mind should be subdued. And once one knows the control of the mind is their final aim, it is futile to make an interminable study of them. What is required for such control is actual inquiry into oneself by self-interrogation. Who am I? How can this inquiry in quest of the self be made by means of the studying of the scriptures? One should realize the self by the eye of wisdom. Does Rama need a mirror to recognize himself as Ram? That to which I refers is within the 5 sheets, whereas the scriptures are outside them. Therefore, it is futile to seek by means of the study of the scriptures the self that has to be realized by summarily rejecting even the 5 sheets. To inquire, who am I, that is in bondage, and to know one's real nature alone is liberation. To keep the mind constantly turned within and to abide thus in the self is alone Atma Vichara or self-inquiry, whereas dhyana or meditation consists in fervent contemplation of the self as Sat Chit Anand, being, consciousness, bliss. Indeed, at some time, one will have to forget everything that has been learned. The realized man stands forth as that to which all the attributes enumerated by the scriptures refer. To him, therefore, these sacred texts are of no use whatever.